Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I don't know everyone's location one by one, but you're all welcome. We're living through some very dark, harsh days, but it's great pleasure to announce that tonight we have someone to bring a bit of light to these dark days. A multi-talented Haig Utidjian, who is also my grandpa teacher, I have to say. He's a wonderful teacher. He'll be soon introduced in more detail by another wonderful musician, Kilingarian, who is there in one of the windows. I'm Katerina Razan. I'm the director of Armenian Institute, and at the moment we are all muted. You will have an opportunity to ask questions to Haig after his presentation. We will encourage you to use the chat line, which we will monitor and try to answer as many questions as possible. We will sharing a feedback form about the session. We'll be very grateful if you can fill it in. Another request is that we are recording the session, so if you don't want to be seen, you can obviously turn your videos off. Message us on the chat if you have any more questions. And I'd like to thank you to my colleagues who are here tonight with me. Special thanks to Dr. Susan Patty, Armenian Institute's founder, director, and current program manager, who organized this fantastic event. My colleague, librarian Tntesean, and Armenian Institute trustee Stephen Masters, who is helping me with technical hosting side of the event. But now, Levon, to you. Enjoy the evening.
Well, it again gives me great pleasure to not only to introduce Haig, but I hope this time not to embarrass him as much as I did when I last introduced him.
Did you embarrass me? I have no recollection of any embarrassment.
We've known each other for many years. I was very much part of Haig's educational years in the UK when he abandoned a very promising career in science to follow in the footpath of a lot of us who have taken this shaky path to music, be it academic or practical. And Haig got his love for Armenian music from a wonderful pair of church people in Cyprus, Archbishop Zareh Aznaworean of blessed memory, and my great uncle Vaham Bedelian. Unlike the rest of us, he actually listened and really fell in love with this music, which he has now been studying for many years. He has been decorated, quite rightly, with the Komitas medal by the Armenian state and the Yakob Mełapart medal by the National Library of Armenia. And he has many publications, the most recent, the Tntesean and the music of the Armenian Hymnal, and a new edition of Dvořák's Mass in D for Bärenreiter. And he has an affiliation with the philosophical faculty of Charles University in Prague, where he lives. And Haig is going to trace the development of the melodies of the Armenian Badarak approximately over the last 1,000 years. And he will tell you in more detail where he has traced from which centers, for example, Istanbul. And he's been kind enough to include my paternal grandfather as one of the many, many masters in the 19th century who developed church music. And he will end by touching on the exquisite orchestral suite by Zareh Aznaworean, based on the Mass by Komitas Vartabet. So Haig, with great, great pleasure, I hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Levon, for this extremely kind introduction. I shall now share my screen, which I hope you can see. It is, of course, a very beautiful site, Dadivank in Artsakh, and it is not one that I have chosen by accident, because Artsakh is very much in our thoughts at present. We shall also see that it was a center of musical culture from a very long time in the past, and we shall have occasion to go there, so to speak, amongst other centers of music and culture. I should like to start with a little musical excerpt. That is a small excerpt from the Divine Liturgy, one of the several versions of the Lord's Prayer that Archimandrite Komitas arranged. In fact, he used this particular melody and harmonization of it for mixed choir for one of his concerts. So this was a concert version. We started the Divine Liturgy in Prague's Church of St. Giles some years ago, when, as part of the summer course organized each year by the Czech Society for Sacred Music, I was called upon to lead weeks worth of rehearsals with quite a gifted group of singers, culminating in the Divine Liturgy in the Komitas version that was performed liturgically in this very church, followed by very lengthy Vespers that same afternoon, partly indoors and partly outdoors as required, given that it was the Sunday of the elevation of the Holy Cross, Kachverats. And those people who sang, they were mostly Czechs, although there were a couple of Slovaks as well, and there was a Dutch gentleman singing bass also. So the plan for this session is to start a little bit with a personal note to indicate what the relevance of this music and what its importance is for me personally. And then we shall start essentially an historical treatment, starting from the earliest known musical contributors to the music of the Divine Liturgy, the notation that they used, what those sources look like, the earliest extant sources that are available to us. Subsequently, a new method of musical transcription had been invented early in the 19th century in Constantinople, and it is to that system that we owe most of what we have now, together with Western stuff. and we shall compare some of the extant variants that are available to us. We shall explore the various attempts to harmonize those melodies, mostly in the second half of the 19th century, and what reception was accorded to these. And we shall proceed by looking at some open problems that remain. And then finally, the music of the divine liturgy on the concert stage. Having presented my historical narrative, I shall then indulge in some musical demonstrations and illustrations so that you can really experience some of those things and compare and contrast them. And once that has concluded, I shall be very glad to answer any questions that may arise. My personal experiences, my earliest personal experiences were in Cyprus, in this little but exquisitely beautiful Greek Orthodox church in Agios Zometios, where I got used to the chanting and conducting of Levon's great uncle, Vahan Bedelian, or uncle, perhaps, Vahan Bedelian, whose singing I remember very well, but also I remember the most exciting experience when all of a sudden, instead of the monophonic singing, there was a beautiful choir of 4 voices, a mixed chorus, singing the Ekmalian version of the liturgy. It was an unforgettable experience. In those days, it did not happen every Sunday, but only on special festive occasions, and it made its mark. The second person also who had a very strong influence on me, whom Levon has mentioned, was Archbishop Zareh Aznaworean of blessed memory, who encouraged and inspired my own first steps. At the same time, in addition to the Ekmalian version of the liturgy that one would hear from time to time, I discovered a score of the Komitas liturgy that I had never heard myself. And as a child, I managed to appropriate my mother's reel-to-reel tape recorder, borrow a cassette recorder, and try and record myself with my own voice. A chest register, falsetto, everything in between, the chants of the liturgy, trying to re-record over myself 3 times or 4 times. As you can imagine, with each successive layer, with my primitive equipment, the amount of background noise increased. I soon found out that if there's a part which has long notes, I should record these last and sing the ones where everything is moving all the time. Otherwise, I can't tell how long I need to wait until I proceed. No click tracks available to me when I was an 11-year-old or 12-year-old when I tried those things. The next step was when I was invited, the same year that I had been invited to Armenia to perform with the Armenian Philharmonic Orchestra. After my concert with the orchestra, the Cathedral Church Choir of St. Sarkis, where the Archbishop of Yerevan has his seat, they very kindly invited me to train them in the Komitas liturgy, because until then they had only sung the Ekmalian version. So it was a great honor for me to teach them the Komitas liturgy and to perform it several Sundays before returning to Prague. And I have to say that I consider it a much greater honor, as well as a much more satisfying pleasure, to work with that chorus than with the Armenian Philharmonic Orchestra. The next invitation was that of which you heard a tiny little fragment a moment ago, the Convivium, the summer masterclasses of the Czech Sacred Musical Society, which culminated in the Chachverat services, the services on the occasion of the elevation of the Holy Cross, which we undertook on the 11th of September 2011. So it's almost 10 years ago. Then I ended up in Copenhagen for some time, and I was called upon to teach Danish singers the Ekmalian liturgy at the request of the ambassador. So that was another pleasure. I had to conduct during the service, sing the deacon's parts, as well as play the organ using my head and my arms and whatever I could. Again, very exciting and satisfying. But one of my very greatest pleasure, particularly as far as the Komitas version of the Armenian Divine Liturgy, was in Kadıköy, in the Constantinopolitan Church on the Asian side of Istanbul, the very church where the greatest Armenian musicologist of all time, Tntesean, had himself served as director of music, where I was really very, very impressed and surprised by the manner in which, although they are amateur singers, and not very many of them, but the way they interpreted Komitas liturgy, somehow it felt very right, very convincing. And of course, the combination of devoutness as well as musicality that one hears in Constantinopolitan churches today, perhaps one of very few places where one can, perhaps the last bastion of a tradition at its best, was there. And it was a very treasurable experience that I am delighted to remember and to acknowledge. Let us start with the earliest bits of information that we've got. One is about Khachadur of Daron, who was abbot of Haghartsin, the church that you see below, of whom there are reports that when a field mass, an outdoor mass, was convened in Lori in northern Armenia, probably around 1204, he stood up and he sang himself the hymn that is still used every time the Divine Liturgy is celebrated, called Chorurt Chorin. Now, in all probability, the melodies that are known to us are very different from what he may have sung on that occasion. But it appears that words and music made such an impression that nowadays it would be inconceivable to have the Divine Liturgy without this hymn. And it is one that is much loved in all its various versions. A slightly earlier thing, though, which we must not forget, is the contribution of none other than one of the greatest Armenian saints and theologians of all time, who was at the same time one of the most prodigious hymnographers in the Armenian tradition, namely Saint Narses the Gracious, who was Catholicos of the Armenian Church in Cilicia in the 12th century. And we have various reports of the sweet music and lovely melodies that he bestowed to the Divine Liturgy, composing hymns of his own. And so during moments in the liturgy where people would wait in silence as the celebrant recited his prayers, hymns were furnished by him, words as well as music, and the impression is mystical. We have two alternative accounts. The first one from the historian, 13th century historian Giragos of Kantsag, that is just outside the boundaries of Artsakh, Nahorny Karabakh these days. It's now the city of Ganja. But already we had historians and musicians from that part of the world. And the historian Giragos of Kantsag refers to the mystical and sweet melodies of the Divine Liturgy that Saint Narses furnished. His image you can see here, opposite part of the breviary where his celebrated prayer, Havadov Khostovani, might confess with faith, Ide Confiteor, may be seen. This is from a manuscript kept in Vienna from the 15th or 16th centuries. The exact scope of how much Saint Narses contributed to the music of the Divine Liturgy is not certain. And in fact, my late teacher, Archbishop Zareh, has published an interesting study on it, as have others. But we know that at the very least, he contributed quite a few hymns that we continue to sing in the Divine Liturgy. And the Venetian Father Revont Alishan, in fact, has a more maximalist point of view. He even considered the hymn Christos Imech Merhait Netzav to belong to the saint's pen. There are some uncertainties because there are certain parts of the liturgy that are acknowledged as being Saint Narces's compositions in a lot of manuscripts, whilst a minority of manuscripts attest to some of the other contributions in the Divine Liturgy. One of the very earliest sources known to me is this book of odes that is kept in Paris at the Bibliothèque Nationale, copied in Cilicia at the monastery of Dvořák, which is in the Adana region in 1241. This manuscript is famous, amongst other things, because it is the earliest known source for the odes of St. Gregory of Narek. But at the end, there's a substantial section that has the chants of the Armenian Divine Liturgy. You can see on the left-hand side, in the middle, is Haig Utidjian, yes, the Lord's Prayer, but in a slightly different version. On the right-hand side folio, you can see the communion hymn, Christos Badarak Chants, with some very dense numations. I regret that I don't have a color photograph of this because the neumes, the musical signs, are in red in this manuscript, whilst the words are in black. So if you don't know Armenian letters, you would be able to distinguish at a glance what is a musical sign and what is verbal, part of the verbal text. Now, these neumes we are not able to decipher, but we can try and do a bit of detective work to try and eke out as much information as we can about the chants, even without knowing the precise meaning of the neumes. This is from another pair of folios, where you can see here, this is said or sung or recited by the Lord Nerses, the Catholicos of Armenians, the head of the Armenian Church. So this is another one of his contributions acknowledged in this early codex. But we have quite a few types of manuscripts that have the chants of the Divine Liturgy. We have a category of manuscripts that are known as manrusmunk, minute study. These mostly include breviary chants that are used during the divine offices that take place throughout the day, 7 times. But some manuscripts have some of the chants of the Divine Liturgy as well. And this particular one, which is kept in Vienna, again in the Mkhitarist monastery, actually has very nearly the complete Divine Liturgy. On the bottom left-hand side folio, you see Surp, Der Zorutians, it's a Sanctus. You can see some of the neumes there. Here, left-hand side, you have the Lord's Prayer. Yes, also, once again, a slightly different grammatical form. And here is that same hymn, which is usually attributed to St. Nerses the Gracious, but we don't have all of it because sadly some of the folios are misplaced. And yet a third manuscript that I was able, I should have said this manuscript is kept in San Lazzaro in Venice at the Mkhitarist monastery. Another Vienna manuscript, slightly later this time, from 1377, also includes the Divine Liturgy, but this is a missal, so it includes the celebrant's parts as well. Here we have the hymn Christos Imechmer Haitnetzav that Father Alishan also attributed to St. Nerses the Gracious. Here on the right-hand side, with red neumes, you can see Surp, the Sanctus, together with the prayers that are recited by the celebrant during the chanting in secret, in a low voice. And this is a further instance of the neumes being in red. And it is another hymn that is usually attributed to St. Nerses the Gracious. And this is the final excerpt where you can see one of the parts sung by the celebrant. So it's not secret, it is public. The melody is Isur, Pisur, Padvagan, Marnoyev, Harere, Djaran, Meroyev, Perchin Isusi, Christosi. Tasrages suxer putiam, Forichal, Hergnitz, Pashri, Michimerum. Sayegiang, Hui, Sarutun, Ikavutun, Yevitotun, Mehat. Samosa satsek tiaras ruzomeru, Samosa satsek yergnavor takaboris meruman mahin, At which point most Armenian people expect to hear the Kyrie eleison. But it is not here because it did not yet exist. It was a late addition in the 18th century. So at that point where you see the blue arrow, that is where these days we sing the Kyrie eleison. Then the deacon sings the litany Psalmos Asatsek, sing a psalm, and then we have another one of the chants attributed to St. Narcissus the Gracious with red musical signs. This will give you a flavor of what these early sources look like. They are mute because we can't read the musical signs, but they are at the same time eloquent in that there's quite a lot we can tell by comparing them to each other. So for instance, I decided I'd make a comparison of some of the chants from these three manuscripts. The first one was from 1241, the second 1313, the third 1377. So you see, we're talking about the time horizon of a century and a half. And for some of the chants, like the Sanctus, if you look at the first word, the Sur, holy, the neumes are completely different in those sources. But if we looked at Haig Utidjian, they're virtually identical. The Lord's Prayer has very different nummations in the three sources, but another Tntesean orally hymn has identical nummations. So it would seem that what was considered to have been composed by the saint was sacrosanct, and the scribes dutifully reproduced the same neumes, whereas other bits that existed before, there may have been more latitude, more freedom, and for the Sanctus and for the Lord's Prayer and various other bits that may have been sung rather than recited, there was more freedom and more variety. Of course, one cannot leap to such conclusions on the basis of comparing a mere handful of manuscripts, but that is the impression one gets. And here, for example, you can see Haig Utidjian, and the neumes are the same in all three of those sources. An interesting instance is the communion and thanksgiving hymn, Christos Badarak, and its various sections. Now, it appears that in its earlier form, this hymn had more than is sung these days during the liturgies that we know. And Father Utidjian, the Vienna guitarist, actually has reconstructed a text that has many more stanzas than are generally known at the moment. But if you look at 1241 manuscript, the black and white one, you will actually see things there that Utidjian doesn't seem to be aware of. And if we compare the neumes, if you look at the top, the Christos Badarak, it's the same for all three manuscripts. But the Madik section, it has different words in different sources. And we can find in the earliest manuscript, both the bit that you can see at the bottom of the second manuscript, again, there are the same neumes, and the same thing applies for the bit that you can find in the third manuscript. So this has very similar neumes to this, and this are all from this manuscript, from the next folio. So you can see that the things that the saint wrote, St. Narcissus the Gracious, they seem to have been accorded a special reverence, and the neumes have been kept invariant. This is just a preliminary sort of account of the kind of things that we can do by looking at the neumes and by collating various sources together. If we want to hear melodies, though, we have to fast forward through several centuries to the point where a novel musical system of notation was invented by the Constantinopolitan church musician Hantartsum Limongian, in association with Father Minas Pezeshkian, one of the Viennese fathers, but who also spent a lot of time in Vienna. You can see that what happened is that 7 of the medieval neumes were adopted and redefined in a sort of tonic solfa system of notation that is no longer pneumatic, because each note has a particular pitch, and each sign represents one note. And we owe this system of notation most of what has reached us, together with the Western staff notation, of course. And the first published version of the Divine Liturgy to use this system of notation was sponsored by the Constantinopolitan Catholicos of all Armenians in Etchmiadzin, Kevork IV, who employed Nigoros Tashtian, another Constantinopolitan musician, to transcribe those melodies. Now, until recently, it used to be thought that Garabed Baghdadlian, the gentleman on the extreme right, was initially commissioned to transcribe melodies, but he got rather annoyed in that the Catholicos would insist on his own melodies being written down and left in anger. But very recent research by Raram Kerovkian has demonstrated that things were not as they were assumed hitherto. And by unearthing some unknown correspondence between Nigoros Tashtian and various persons in Etchmiadzin, we see that it was not Tashtian exclusively who did this, and Tashtian himself was repeatedly frustrated by the fact that even at the stage of proofreading, it appears that the Catholicos and Garabed Baghdadlian were tampering with his transcriptions, and it appears the Catholicos was actually giving precedence to some of Garabed's melodies. And ironically, it was published under Tashtian's name, and afterwards he found himself having to defend a piece of work about which he himself had reservations, because some of it he did not agree with, although much of it was his own work. So the situation is much more nuanced, as you might imagine. And if you want to delve into this correspondence, I strongly recommend this valuable monograph published by Aram the year before last. So an instance of the result in the version that was reprinted in Varar Shabbat, present-day Etchmiadzin, looks like this. This is the very same hymn, O profound mystery, inaccessible and without beginning, Chorut Chorin, the hymn that goes back to Chachadur of Daron, who sang it at the field mass, as we said. And slightly different versions of this melody were used both by Komitas and Yegmalian for their respective choral arrangements. But it's not the only version, and other versions may be found. And in fact, the entire set of chants of the Divine Liturgy was published in Constantinople using the same musical notation in 1934, and it was characteristically called Mariaganag, the main melodies. So the Constantinopolitan musicians, who always were keen on their own way of doing things, did not really accept those other versions and created their own. On the right-hand side, you can see a particularly beautiful version of the Sanctus that I first heard in Cologne in Germany, sung by a gifted group of Constantinopolitan musicians who had been invited there to perform the Divine Liturgy for the ordination of a clergyman. And I subsequently had the pleasure in hearing it in different churches. What I have to say, of course, is that the musicians there, who are masters of their art, don't necessarily stick to the notation. It is used only as a basis, and they ornament it with all sorts of little decorations, and they endow the music with a sense of spontaneity, so that you get the point, you get the impression that they're almost improvising at the moment, even if they may not do so. And to try and record very precisely what they're doing is counterproductive, because you would have to engage in such a complex form of notation that if you try to reproduce it mechanically, you completely destroy that sense of spontaneity and sort of unmeasured element that is such an important component of the chanting. These are not the only versions of the melodies, though, and my own dear teacher, Vahan Bedelian, whom I already had occasion to mention, in one of his manuscripts, which his grandsons very generously allowed me to study and photograph, there are a couple of pages of chants which are referred to as the melody from Sebaste in Asia Minor. part of historical Armenia, where there was a substantial Armenian community. That is where the founder of Mkhitarist order, Mkhitar of Sebast, came from. And here, the aforementioned melody, Christos imech merhait netzav, is recorded in a version that is unique to me. I've never heard it, and I have never encountered it in any other source, which makes it all the more valuable. I'll try and sing a little bit of it for you. Christos imech merhait netzav, Oren Astված Աստված մեր, Haig Utidjian seinen Schätzav, zur Ochchuni And so it continues with this very strange to our ears, our modern European ears, with this very strange and unusual modality. And so we are extremely grateful to Baron Bedelian, who, without whose transcription, certainly I would not have known of this melody at all. Another set of melodies for the Divine Liturgy that differs very substantially from the sort of mainstream that we associate with Constantinople and also those transcriptions that were published in Valar Shabbat, is that of the Mkhitarist fathers, particularly those in Venice. And the eminent Venetian Italian musician Pietro Bianchini, who is one of my special interests, he was so enamored of the music of the Mkhitarist monks in Venice that he spent some time on the island of San Lazzaro transcribing from 1857, arranging and rearranging. Some things he harmonized, others he didn't. Things he harmonized, he rearranged, he even produced alternative versions for some of those melodies. He even wrote a string orchestral accompaniment. And I suspect that he may even have been subtly influenced in his own compositions in Western style by his saturation of Armenian sacred chant. And I managed to find a little slip of paper attached at the end of one of his manuscripts. It appears that he copied out some choral sections of his arrangements, writing the Armenian words in Italian transliteration, because it seems possible that on San Lazzaro, during festal celebrations of the Mass, perhaps Italian professional singers sang in those performances. So he wrote the words in Italian so that they could read. And he has left instructions for them saying how they should perform, because this art has the power of rendering these chants sublime, celestial, and at once most pleasing to our hearts and to our ears. These are the words of Bianchini. I shall now play you very briefly the beginning of a melody that is unique to the Venetian tradition of the Ode and the Rialt hast du so, chosen of God, elect of God, that is performed when the celebrant is bishop or of higher rank. Of course, the harmonizations are very interesting. Bianchini was not familiar with the Oriental maqams and the Armenian Eastern modes, and so you will find that some of the chords, although they bespeak of his own musicality, are perhaps somewhat disconcerting to us because we associate some of the tonal axes with other notes than the ones that are implied by his harmonization. This photograph is from a manuscript written in Bianchini's own hand, which he dedicated to the Armenian Catholic Patriarch of the day, and it's kept at the Library of Congress. And I'm very, very grateful to Dr. Levon Avdoyan of the Library of Congress, who made it available to me, indeed, who drew it to my attention. Now, I mentioned the greatest Armenian musicologist of all time. I hope Aram will not take offense by my calling Tntesean the greatest and not him. He comes close though. But Yeria Tntesean, we don't have transcriptions of the Divine Liturgy by him, but there's a little known article of his where he describes the succession of the modalities and tonal centers of the Divine Liturgy in his own time. We're talking about more or less the middle of the 19th century Constantinople. From that description, you can tell that it's not very different from what we know now, but also that at times there would be chaos because something would finish in one mode and it would not harmonize well with what went before, which also is a phenomenon with which some of us are all too familiar in our own time. So there's evidence to suggest that what was done in the 19th century was probably quite close to what we are familiar with now. Let us now look at some of the attempts to harmonize those melodies. Christopor Karamurza is a remarkable personality, and he was largely neglected until recently, largely because his own harmonization of the Divine Liturgy had been considered to be lost. We are extremely fortunate in that it was unearthed very recently by the late Gregory of Narek, who managed to find it in Armenia. It had been under the very nose of the musicologists there, but it was Gregory who noticed it. And he used the Limongian notation, albeit in a slightly unorthodox manner. And I should like to say something about the circumstances. And again, without wishing to remind you of the very tragic war that is going on at the moment, the premiere of his harmonized version of the Divine Liturgy took place on Easter Day in 1886 in Baku, the present-day capital of Azerbaijan, which was the center of a very large Armenian community, and it was a major cultural center in those days. Karamurza maintained a correspondence and even personal acquaintance with Tikran Chukhajian, the very distinguished Armenian opera composer, Pietro Bianchini, the Venetian master, whom I mentioned in connection with my last slide, and the composer who was based in Tiflis, Mikhail Ippolitov Ivanov. He was allowed to continue to conduct the harmonized four-part version of the Divine Liturgy for some time, but he was stopped in his tracks in 1890 by Bishop Mesrob Sempadyan. And there's a story that is likely to be true. The bishop got rather annoyed by this modernity, but he wanted to give the impression that he was fair. So he summoned Karamurza and the choir, and he said, okay, sing me this bit, first in the harmonized version, and they sang it. And then he said, now sing it to me in a single voice. And they did that again. He said, single voice is better. He put a stop to the harmonized version. Karamurza could do nothing about it, but to indicate his protestations, symbolically at least, he presented the bishop with a candelabrum which had 4 candles, but he extinguished 3 of the candles. He blew them out and gave the candelabrum to him with only 1 candle. This is what you want. Instead of light from 4 candles, you want just the one. You want only 1 voice. You reject my harmonization. But Karamurza got a second chance. He was appointed to the Mother See of Etchmiadzin, and there he was able to premiere his 4-part Divine Liturgy on the feast of Saints Thaddeus and Bartholomew. In Etchmiadzin, he was able also to conduct harmonizations of secular songs, and one is Pam Porodan, of which the words were composed by Father Revont Alishan, whom we mentioned a little earlier in connection with his research on, let's say, the Gracious' contributions to the Divine Liturgy, and the Venetian musician Pietro Bianchini. Now, some surprising facts. When Karamurza conducted the choir in Etchmiadzin, the young Komitas, who was a novice at the monastery, was a member of the choir, and Karamurza would give Komitas some solos to sing from time to time. But the young Komitas apparently was conservative, and Komitas protested to Karamurza, saying, God is one, music too should be sung in a single voice. To which apparently Karamurza responded by saying, why do you forget that God is the union of three persons? Later on, of course, Komitas produced harmonizations of his own of the Divine Liturgy, but it is interesting to know that he was initially a conservative. And of course, Karamurza provoked the enmity of the conservatives in Etchmiadzin, of whom there was a fair number at that time. They would say the church is a holy place, not a theater. And of course, Karamurza happened to be a Catholic, and that was held against him. Let the composer go to his papish comrades and propagate his harmonizations there. God is one, singing should be in a single voice. Polyphony is appropriate to polytheism and not to monotheism. And polyphony is a feature of Catholic tradition, and it is against the traditions of the Armenian Orthodox Church. And Catholicos Magar passed away. He was replaced by Mgrdich Chrimian, known as Chrimian Haig, and there were many hopes that Chrimian is going to be more forward-looking. But in fact, it appears that after he assumed office, Chrimian sided with the conservatives, at least initially, and eventually he caved in and he dismissed Karamurza. And in a sort of bittersweet way, Chrimian is supposed to have expelled him by saying, you are a great master, very useful to the nation. The work you have started here is good work, but the seminary walls are too narrow for you. Go away. And yet, soon after that, Komitas was allowed to conduct four-part versions of various items in the Divine Liturgy, starting with the Harmer, the Lord's Prayer, but more and more bits and pieces. And of course, the conservatives got very annoyed, and this time they accused the Komitas liturgy of reeking of Protestantism. An important development was when in 1895, Catholicos Chrimian authorized the use of Yekmalian's harmonization. Interestingly enough, Yekmalian had been Komitas's teacher. And something similar happened a little later when two Catholicoi later, Catholicos Kevork V, approved of Amy Apkar's harmonized version. That's a completely different set of melodies that are believed to be peculiar to the new Julfa tradition, and they were published in Calcutta, initially at the end of the 19th century and then in about 1920. So the church did lend its approval to harmonized performances of the Divine Liturgy, the Armenian Church. And a theological argument had to be found. For example, if we look at the introduction to the first publication in Leipzig of Yekmalian's harmonization of the Divine Liturgy, he says that harmonization is not inappropriate, and it is not against the spirit of our church, since harmonization constitutes the perfection and fulfillment of all music. And our ancestors always sought the perfection of sacred music. They tried to make the sacred chants of our church perfect and the most beautiful possible, according to the state of development of the art of music in each century. He did make the point of stating explicitly that he had left the melodies, the single voice melodies, as they had been published in Bavar Shabbat a decade earlier, invariant. So the melodies were kept unchanged, and his harmonizations, though very beautiful, are rather conservative. he purposely sought to avoid chromaticism and any sort of adventurousness. However, harmonized divine liturgy was allowed and was sanctioned in the Armenian Church. It is interesting to contrast this with the position with the Greek Orthodox Church. And if I may briefly quote from an encyclical issued by the Holy Synod, as a reaction to the use of harmonized melodies sung in Greek Orthodox churches in Vienna, we see that it was considered to be a sinful innovation. And the Synod wrote, "It is a grave mistake and dangerous, and will cause greater transgressions and novelties to be introduced in the future. It grieves our heart. It approaches the customs of the foreigners and the heterodox. What worse could you want? Four-part harmony seduces the ears, charms the senses, and enfeebles the soul." Interestingly enough, Karamurza was delighted. Even though his own version had been forbidden, things had moved on, and the Ekmalyan version had been permitted, and he enthusiastically and with great he even befriended Ekmalyan, he praised the Ekmalyan version, and on one occasion even conducted it for Ekmalyan himself, who was very satisfied. So Karamurza was really a man of astonishing generosity of spirit. His own version had been considered lost as my late friend Gregory of Narek discovered it. Of course, it appears that Karamurza had produced more than one version, because the Egypt-based musicologist Dr. Haig Utidjian published brief excerpts from yet another version by Karamurza as well. Utidjian has also written a fine monograph about Karamurza, and we are very grateful to him for his discovery and for allowing Karamurza to occupy a place in our consciousness that he richly deserves, I think. However, the version that you hear these days in most Armenian churches is the Ekmalyan harmonization, and it does include melodies of which we do not know the source. And it is suspected that those couple of melodies that we can't find elsewhere, but in his harmonized volume of 1890, may well reflect what used to be sung in Echmiadzin, in present-day Armenia, before the domination of the Constantinopolitan melodies may have driven out and driven to oblivion the melodies that used to be sung there. And the Lord's Prayer, Haer Mer, may be one of those. I know that the late Krikor asked me at the St. Narcisse Seminary in New Rochelle, where we met some years ago, do you know where this melody comes from? Because I can't find a source for it. So that's quite interesting thing. I mentioned the Amy Abkar melodies. She came from a very distinguished family whose origins were in New Julfa. She published several volumes embracing the entire Divine Liturgy in Calcutta. And I'm most grateful to Professor Sebuh Aslanyan and Mrs. Liz Chater for this photograph and for information about the date of her passing. It appears that she conducted this version of the Divine Liturgy for many years, probably in the Armenian Church of St. Nazareth in Calcutta. We don't know exactly who harmonized the melodies that she faithfully transcribed, because in her preface she says that the harmonizations were undertaken with the assistance of Dr. Slater, who was the organist of St. Paul's Anglican Cathedral in Calcutta at the time. Now, again, the harmonizations are not bad, but they appear to have been done by someone who is not really particularly saturated with the modality of Armenian music. So I shall now play you briefly the version of the Sanctus, which is very similar to the melody Havun Havun, transcribed by Komitas, an ode due to St. Gregory of Narek, or the Chorurt Chorin, first sung by Khachadur of Daron. Similar melody. special choice of tonic would be imagine a pedal below. In fact, it is very similar to the Marian sung in Constantinople. It is sung in such a way that a harmonization of this sort would be inconceivable. Let's return to another interesting version, which I happen to possess in manuscript form in the Limongian notation, a very generous gift by my dear friend, the Reverend Dr. George A. Leylegian, and it is the Kilingarian version. One version was published in Smyrna in Limongian notation, and a later version in Western staff notation in Jerusalem quite a few years later. And as a student in England, I had the privilege of seeing a manuscript in Western notation at the Kilingarian home where I was a guest, and I was able to try out the harmonization at the piano. I would say that the harmonization is not so interesting to me, but some of the melodies that were captured by Kilingarian are of considerable interest. For example, there's a melody here of Christos imech merheit netzav that we don't hear these days, except in Vienna and in Venice, amongst the Mkhitarist fathers, who, however, have a harmonization by one A. Ponzilacqua, who appears to have been the Italian composer Aureliano Ponzilacqua. And the melody is along the lines of Christos imech merheit netzav morenas. Is different from the melodies that were harmonized by Yakob and Komitas, and which most of us know. The Sanctus, the Surp Surp, is not dissimilar, but of course the harmonization of Yakob one finds much more satisfactory. But you have to remember Yakob had been trained in the Western tradition, whereas people like Kilingarian and Karamurza were naturally very musical, but they had not had a Western musical training. Criticize and say there were consecutive fifths there. Of course, even Handel had consecutive fifths. This is the Yakob version. And you see, Yakob has a more generous palette of chords available. He can use things in, professional musicians will know what I'm talking about. In addition to root position, they use first inversion chords, second inversion chords. They have more variety. Now, Komitas was the most adventurous in his own version. And there are two published versions. Atayan, rather more recently than the Paris version, which is the best known, tried to get rid of corrections made, as he assumed, by Vartan Sarkisyan, and to produce a kind of text, which is a little different. There's much more work to be done in that area, as I shall mention in a moment. But Komitas also made use of melodies not otherwise known. His version of the Ode under Rialta Studzov, which I briefly played the Bianchini Venetian version, for example, I'm not aware from any other source, and it sounds like this. I'm singing it here with a group of Czech friends. Most grateful to Dr. Marika Pečena, who very kindly arranged for this to be recorded at St. Peter's Church in central Prague. Now, let us see how the same melody of Chorut Chorin as we heard, and now by Komitas. Exactly the same, precisely the melody as it was published by Varasha. They're both slightly different, but they're only slightly different from it and from each other. And yet the effect is completely different. It will be an interesting experiment. We shall now see what Karamurza, Yekmalyan, and Komitas did with Marmin Derunagan. We can't include Kilingarian in the comparison because the melody that he used and harmonized is very different to that used by the others. So the first is Karamurza, in the edition published by the late Grigor Pideggian. It's a sort of harmonization that would be done by an extremely musical, talented person who has not studied harmony. Very simple chords, all in root position, even parallels, but all the right instincts. Now, let us look at the Yekmalyan version, which is very noble, elegant, correct, and beautiful. unpublished versions by Komitas. The more conservative one is already more adventurous than Yekmalian's. But now listen to this other harmonization by Komitas, which is a stroke of genius, forward-looking, magical harmonies, unusual chords that you would not be, you can find such chords not before Schoenberg's Second Chamber Symphony, the beginning and the ending, Benjamin Britten, Rejoice in the Lamb, Franck Martin, Petite Symphonie Concertante, and it shifts the tonal axis and it does some beautiful cheating, so we end up having modulated, as I'll try to show. What excited me when I was a 12-year-old and I looked at those scores and I tried to play them at the piano and I tried to record them with myself in the three parts. Now, Komitas published a critique once the Yekmalian version appeared, and he was rather merciless in his criticisms against his own teacher's version. But the main value of that article is that it serves as a manifesto about his own ideals, and he wrote it planning his own version as he did so. So for one thing, he wanted the stresses of the language and of the melody to kiss each other, he said. I think that he was probably thinking of Psalm 84, which says, mercy and truth are met together. Righteousness and peace have kissed each other. So he wanted to achieve a perfect union between the natural stresses of the language and the stresses implied by the contours of the melody. And he desired to create a version of the Divine Liturgy that was constituted and conceived as a unified artistic work, tending towards perfection, as he said. Now, I shall very briefly digress a little and say, given that we've got highly manuscripts in Komitas's hand that look like graffiti, like a bird's nest, that are not easy to read, as well as a fair copy of only a few pages of the Divine Liturgy in the form in which it has been published. Some changes are believed to have been made by Vartan Sarkisyan. It's not clear who did what. Robert Tntesean did what he could, as I mentioned. But given that this is probably the greatest artistic work ever produced, musical artistic work ever produced by any Armenian, it is perhaps the greatest treasure in the whole Armenian repertory. It deserves a proper musicological evaluation of all the sketches and their publication, their collation, their analysis, because we can get inside the mind of Komitas and see what he was doing. This has been done in the case of other composers. Indeed, I myself have been working on Dvořák's Mass in D, and most recently the Czech Museum of Music commissioned me to undertake a study of the sketches for the work. And I've produced an edition of the work itself, a new critical edition. But the sketches give us more information. They allow you to penetrate into the composer's mind and see what he did first. Then he decided he'd do something different. And this sort of thing needs to be done with Komitas's Divine Liturgy as well. Now, this is a fair copy. This is and the Rialt, of which you heard a recording of my singing it with some friends at St. Peter's Church in Prague. And this is a very fair copy, and the published version is identical. But here, if we compare the draft on the left-hand side and the fair copy on the right-hand side, again, the difference is not very great. But look at this. On the left-hand side, the processional hymn Parechos Utiam, well, it's not easy to make head and tails of it. He's even made some corrections in the Limongian notation between the lines to save space. All this material needs to be studied, deciphered, explained. We can gain very much in terms of understanding of his singing if we engage in this, and it does need to be done in my opinion. A brief note about other versions. Now, the mereti, the odes that are performed during the preparation of the gifts early in the Divine Liturgy, have been fair game for church musicians to compose their own words as well as melodies over the centuries. And likewise, two particular sections, Armenia Ventokvutkum, a dialogue between the clerks and the deacon before the Lord's Prayer, and the Amen Harsuk der Vormia pair, and many musicians, mostly in Constantinople as far as we know, and mostly in the 19th century as far as we know, have been composing using different Ottoman makams, including Aristakes Hovhannisyan, who unfortunately was photographed only after he passed away, Ampartsum Cherchian, who was director of music of the seminary in Armash for many years and proved to be very influential, but also Archbishop Arsène Aydınyan, whose Divine Liturgy is partly composed by himself and partly traditional Armenian melodies, orchestrated with the help of Böhm, not Karl Böhm, but an earlier Viennese Böhm, Arab Artevyan, who was a pupil of Komitas, and who composed a version of the Divine Liturgy with symphony orchestra, but also harmonized some traditional Armenian chants in a very beautiful way. And my two dear friends who have composed very different from each other, but equally fine versions of the Divine Liturgy, Khoren Mehanejian and George Kirazian. I commend these versions very warmly. And I should like to end by talking briefly about a concert suite. Now, when Komitas started performing in Constantinople, bits and pieces of the Divine Liturgy on the concert stage in theaters in Constantinople, he was censured by the clergy, as you might expect. The opposite problem may have occurred in Soviet Armenia, where probably it was not encouraged to perform and record the Komitas Divine Liturgy in a liturgical setting. But Sahagians, who was a brilliant musician, chamber musician, violinist, and director, decided to arrange parts of the Armenian Divine Liturgy, as well as some other parts that are hymns and other chants, but are not part of the Divine Liturgy, and combined them in a very satisfying way as a symphonic suite for string orchestra. And this was allowed to be published. It was no longer a sacred work of church music. It was a concert suite. Now, I have very grave reservations about much Soviet art, but this also, I find, is a stroke of genius. I got used to hearing it on the radio as a child. It used to be played by the late Tntesean, were my music teachers on the Armenian program on the radio. For years and years, I sought a score and I couldn't find one until I visited Armenia in order to conduct the Armenian Philharmonic. And on that occasion, I was also introduced to the late chief conductor of the Armenian Chamber Orchestra, who was a very a wonderful gentleman called Aram Garapegyan, who passed away far too early. And this is contrary to one's other experiences, but in this instance, I went to his office, I introduced myself, and I said, you know, I've been looking for this. Do you know anything about it? He said, yes, I've got it. Here it is. You can have it. He opened the bookcase behind his desk and he said, you know, if you run across the road, there's a photocopying shop. You can get it copied and returned it to me. And I did. Every time I performed this beautiful suite, I bless his memory, because had he been less generous and wished to withhold the score from me, I would not have been able to produce the parts. And with the help of Dr. Vladimir Faltus of the Czech Technical University, I have been working towards a performing version that also takes into account some of the information from Sahagyan's own recording, which was published by Melodia, a mono recording, recorded in 1975, released in 1979, which is very fine. And then I was able to conduct the first European performance of it at the Czech Museum of Music and perform it in different countries, different places, different occasions, in a number of places, not least with my own Charles University Orchestra strings, who have made the work their own and who play it with great affection, understanding and sensitivity. We don't have the time to analyze the work and see how Sahagyants, with enormous skill and sensitivity, he managed to put different bits and pieces together so that it works extra liturgically as a concert piece, as a symphonic piece. But it does work. It works very, very well. And this is from our recent performance at the Mechitarist Church in Vienna, honor 150 years since Komitas's birth. And I should like to end this talk by playing you a little excerpt, the ending, which is the Sanctus, but it's not only the Sanctus. Sahagyants has added other bits and pieces as well, not least passages that are deemed to have been introduced by St. Narcissus the Gracious, with whom we started this lecture. Now, I shall need a moment to find the place that I want to start from. This is a live recording that was made. I was conducting the Charles University Orchestra, the strings that are at the Czech Museum of Music in 2016. I'm very grateful to them, and I'm extremely grateful to Susan Paty, who invited me to give this lecture, and to the Armenian Institute, Takevik and Kagik, to all these organizations and individuals who made this work possible. And I should like to end by saying that it has taken us 1,000 years to get here. So do make sure you enjoy the music of your Badarak, whether it is in a single voice with the traditional modality preserved, with no organ or harmonization, or in all sorts of other forms. All this is part of our heritage and may contribute to a spiritual and artistic experience of great value. This concludes my talk, and I'm now open to questions. Thank you very much indeed for your attention, ladies and gentlemen.